Hi, my name is Sou Ping. Thank you for tuning in. I'm very honored that you have chosen to spend some time with me to talk about Introduction to Singapore Visual Modern Art History. First of all, I would like to thank NAC for supporting this video to make this video possible. Since we are going to spend some time together, allow me to introduce myself. I'm actually the director of Artcommune Gallery. At the same time, I'm also an artist. I was born in 1972, and in secondary one, I took up Chinese ink painting from my art teacher, Mr. Chuan Keng Boon. And it didn't take very long for me to decide that artist is my lifelong goal. But in the 80s and 90s, when I was growing up, having a career in the arts is unthinkable. My mother said to me, "We didn't come from a rich family. Are you sure you want to be an artist?" And I thought about it. I said, "Yeah, you're right." So when I was choosing my university subjects, I decided that I would take a career in teaching. So I took a teaching scholarship to lessen my mother's burden. Why did I choose teaching? I have a very naive idea that teachers have long holidays, and therefore I can spend more time on painting during the long holidays. Of course, that was a naive thinking. But anyway, in the university, physics was very tough. It was actually full of differential equation, which I am totally unable to grasp. And to cut a long story short, I didn't become a teacher. I graduated though. After graduation, I went into manufacturing as an engineer. And I moved from semiconductor and eventually ending up repairing aircraft engines. I spent about 11 years in the corporate world, and it gave me some management skills. In 2008, I opened my first solo show. And during the show, I noticed that people who I don't know come to buy my paintings. And it was a revelation for me because I thought to myself, hey, maybe after all, it is possible to have a career as an artist. So in a matter of 2 years, I found a patron and I quit my daytime job and I became a full-time artist. I set up Artcommune Gallery. Artcommune Gallery in the beginning was purely for me to sell my artworks. But during the course of time, many things happened, and Artcommune Gallery slowly evolved into a leading gallery specializing in Singapore modern art. And one of our vision is to facilitate more people to understand and appreciate the arts. And this is why we have this video today. Over in Artcommune, we have many courses, around 12 to 15 courses. There are basically 3 types of course. The first type is actually to answer the question, why is a painting a good painting? So it is a series of lectures about art appreciation. The second type is on Singapore art history, which is something like what you sign up for today. And the third type is something to do with buying art, because buying art is involve a lot of money, and there are some, I always get questions on how to buy art. So we also have a module on that. If you have any inquiries or questions about this talk or whatever, you can email to that email over there, souping@artcommune.com.sg, and I'll be happy to answer them. This course is designed to help you to have a basic foundation knowledge of the history of Singapore visual modern art development. I want to stress that I am not an art history academician. This course is designed at the entry level. So maybe I may make some mistakes, so please pardon me. This is the structure of today's talk. We'll start with an overview and we'll talk right up to 1941, which is just before World War II. The next section will be the period immediately after the war between 1946 to 1950, which correspond to the first generation. The next part will talk about the post-independence years from the 60s to the 90s, which correspond to the second generation. And finally, we will talk about from the 90s onwards, which corresponds to the age of contemporary art and beyond. I would like to give some acknowledgement from which I draw the contents of today's talk. The first book I want to acknowledge is Migration, Transmission, Localization, Visual Art in Singapore, 1866 to 1945, by Mr. Yao Meng Tong. Mr. Yao is essentially from the education sector, but during his free time, he devoted a lot of energy into research of Singapore art history. He devised a unique method by looking through all the old newspapers, some as old as from the 19th century. And from the newspaper, he could sort of piece out the art scene during those days. The next book I would like to attribute is the book Channels and Confluences by Professor Kwok Kian Chow. I believe we are very familiar with Professor Kwok Kian Chow, as he is the founding director of the Singapore Art Museum and the National Gallery of Singapore. I would like to touch a little bit on the state of art history study in Singapore. By and large, the study of art history in Singapore is very lacking. In the past, we have some Chinese educated Singapore scholars who had done some research from the Chinese media. We have people like Macau Xu with a pen name Ma Ge, and of course Yao Meng Tong, who we have just introduced. There are also other notable art historians like Michael Sullivan. Michael Sullivan is essentially a UK scholar. He recently passed away at a very advanced age of around 90 years old. In the 1950s, he was here in Singapore teaching in the former form of NUS. And T.K. Sababati was his student back then. Otherwise, we really do not have too many people researching on the subject. And this is why there are many gaps in our art history. Another problem we have is that we don't really have art history coming from the Malay or Indian perspective. And this poses a problem for us. You may want to ask, why do we need to know Singapore art history in the first place? I think as a sovereign state, we need to have our own cultural identity so that we can improve our solidarity as a country together. Any group would have shared legends, icon, experience, or belief systems, and these are fostered through culture. And these are the things that gels the organization together. Art and cultural history give us a bearing to questions like, who are we? Where did we come from? And where are we going? We'll move on to part 1, overview and the early years, pre-World War II. The first question that I would like to discuss is, was Singapore a cultural desert? I remember when I was growing up, many people lament that Singapore is a very boring place and is a cultural desert. But contrary to this popular belief, there were already a significant level of cultural activities at the beginning of the 20th century. We must remember that aesthetic needs is one of the basic human needs, and societies forms identities. So for any wealthy and sophisticated societies, they will tend to develop an art scene. Now, in the earlier years, before independence of Singapore, Singapore and Malaya, and in particular Penang and Malacca, was seen as a single entity under the Straits Settlements. And there were many interactions between artists in Singapore and Penang. And therefore, when we talk about the earlier years, we have to look at the two territories in totality. We know very little about the situation in the 19th century. Some stamp collectors, through their collections, have found postcards that were actually art exhibition invitations dating from the late 19th century. And this is how we get to know about some of the early art societies. For example, there was a Penang Impressionist Society formed in 1898. And we know that it held regular shows. There were also documentary proof that in 1905 in Singapore, there was an existence of what we call the Singapore Art Club. This could have been more amateurish groups formed by the white colonial communities in Singapore and Penang, and we know very little about them. The first person I want to introduce to you is this person by the name of Khoo Seok Wan. He lived between 1874 and 1941. He is the first known local artistic/Renaissance person. He was born in China and received a traditional Chinese education. But his father had business in Singapore. And when he was around the age of 22, his father passed away. And he has to come to Singapore to inherit the large fortune left by his father. And at that time, his fortune was valued at 1 million Singapore dollars. But he was a poor businessman, and within about a decade, he went bankrupt in 1907. He was active in the literati circle, being a poet, and because of his great wealth and very high level of poetry that he could compose, he became the central figure in the literati scene. And after he went bankrupt, he found job as an editor to many Chinese newspapers. And during his lifetime, he has association with many visiting Chinese calligraphers and painters. And he himself owned perhaps the first known collection of artworks in Singapore. He basically collected Chinese paintings and calligraphies. And also, when he was around, he actively promoted Chinese calligraphy to other people in the Chinese community here. We must remember that in the late 19th century or early 20th century, Singapore does not have many cultural activities, and most people are just businessmen who have zero knowledge on art. So this was a notable effort from him. And from his activities, we know that already around his lifetime, there were already art activities happening in Singapore. Now, over at the English-speaking community, there is this amateur drawing association formed in 1909. Like its predecessors, they are more like a socializing platform, using cultural activities as its medium. It is probably an elite group because it had distinguished members like Dr. Lim Cheng Ho. This is an example of some of the earliest local artists. This work is by Lo Kway Song, dated 1921. Lo Kway Song was actually studying in Raffles Institution as a medical student, and I think he did this as an hobby and didn't think about selling it for income. So for these early artists, we can say that they did it out of passion and did it in the amateur level. Lo Kway Song eventually did not leave a mark in Singapore art scene. One of the earliest pioneer artists that came up in history is Man Seng. He is born in Kuching and mostly based in Penang. Already in 1920, he set up a studio, and he is the first full-time artist in Malaya. He is a founding member of Penang Chinese Art Club and Society of Chinese Artists in Singapore in 1936. And he was also the one who proposed NAFA, the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, and he pushed the project through. And because of this, some people view him as the father of Malayan art. This is an example of Man Seng's painting, and I would like to highlight to you, this painting is painted in the British watercolor style. The British watercolor style is characterized by broad strokes and not too detailed rendering. The British watercolor style was in vogue in the early 20th century. Japanese artists, Taiwan artists, and many artists in Asia practice this style. We have another painting here by him, And this is very typical of him. Over at the Chinese-speaking community, China had a revolution in 1911, and the 2,000 years of feudal rule was ended, and they moved into a republic, and they started the process of modernization. In line with that, there are Western-style art academies appearing in Shanghai around the 1920s. And because of that, there were graduates from these academies coming to Singapore, or rather they come to the Straits settlements. And this group of professionally trained artists, they start to congregate and form societies. For example, in 1929, in KL, there's this group called the United Artists Malaya. In Chinese, we call Nanyang Suhua Se. Also in Singapore, there was a society known as the Qingnian Lizhi Se. They organized large-scale shows with more than 10 artists in 1929, together with prominent artists like Sou Ping. And in 1939, the ethnic Chinese in Penang formed the Penang Chinese Art Club. Following the formation of the Penang Chinese Art Club, the same group of people traveled to Singapore in 1936, and they formed the Society of Chinese Artists here in Singapore. This was a great milestone for Singapore art because this is the first art club formed by professional artists. The members of these two clubs were mostly alumni of the Chinese art academies, principally the academies in Shanghai. At that time, there were a sizable group of Chinese artists in Singapore, mostly now forgotten. The artistic direction of the Society of Chinese Artists in Singapore follows what we call the Shanghai School. The Shanghai School is a variant of Chinese art that appeared in the early 20th century. The Shanghai School art philosophies included acceptance of Western ideas and hence was different from the classical Chinese art before 1911. The association is still very active today. The Society of Chinese Artists is a very important society in Singapore. Starting from the time it was created up to even today, most of the ethnic Chinese artists are members of this society. Only in the past 1 or 2 decades, where the new artists were more westernized, that some artists did not join this society. Next on the list is an artist by the name of Zhang Ruqi. Zhang Ruqi was a very important early pioneer before World War II. He has achieved a high artistic standard. He was born in China and trained in Shanghai Academy of Fine Arts, arriving in Singapore in 1927. He taught in schools like Tuan Meng, which is a Teochew school, and he also had his own studio doing work for advertisements. In the 1920s, there were a few Chinese artists working here as commercial artists because there was a demand for illustrated advertisement in mediums such as newspapers. So he was a founding president of the Society of Chinese Artists, and he continued on as a president for a few years up to the World War II. Unfortunately, he died in the Sok Ching massacre in 1942, and this is why we don't really know much about him today. This is a still life circa 1930s, an oil on canvas. You can see from this painting that he is actually quite a good artist. For example, the composition is quite well planned. And if you look at the color scheme, for example, the colors of the mango is actually quite complex. Also, during the 1920s and 30s, many prominent Chinese artists visited Singapore, mainly to hold exhibitions to raise funds for the Sino-Japanese War. Sou Ping first came to Singapore while he is en route to Paris, where he was enrolled as a student to study art. He was on scholarship from the Chinese government. These visiting artists provided inspiration and raised standards of artists here. There were some notable stories. For example, the friendship between Lim Cheng Ho and Sou Ping. Lim Cheng Ho met Sou Ping around 1940, and Lim Cheng Ho said that he was greatly inspired by the event. The same thing happened to Chen Wenxi, except that Chen Wenxi met Sou Ping in China much earlier. And also, the fact that these artists came to Singapore to sell their work showed that Singapore was a place which is sort of quite wealthy having the Chinese Tauquis were buying art. But of course, at that time, there were still no art market in Singapore. Next, I would like to introduce to you a theory which I formulated myself. The theory is to help you to understand and memorize the early Singapore art scenes easier. So in the early days, there were three driving forces to Singapore art. First is the British colonial powers. Second is the Asian immigrants. Actually, it means the Chinese, who continued to practice their traditional Chinese art. The third group is also Chinese immigrants, but they decided to change their artistic direction to embrace the sights and sounds of their newfound homeland. The British colonial powers were represented by European art educators, artists, and locals who were educated under the British system. The Amateur Drawing Association consisted of locals who had close associations with the colonial rulers. One of the most representative artists from the colonial community is Richard Walker. Richard Walker is actually from the UK. He was trained in UK as an art teacher, and he came to Singapore in 1923. And his role coming to Singapore is actually as an art educator to fulfill the colonial government's requirements for artistic education. He taught in Raffles Institution and was once the art superintendent of Singapore schools. Now, you may find this position, art superintendent of Singapore schools, like, wow, very big. But actually, in those days, the boundary of Singapore city is actually very small. So, at the north side is somewhere near the Tekka market today, and on the east side is Kampong Glam. Then on the west side is somewhere at Bukit Timah area. In fact, it should be nearer to Tiong Bahru. So Singapore City was actually a very small place. So the term art superintendent of Singapore schools is not really that big as it sounds. Anyway, he was mainly a watercolor artist, and he later produced students like Lim Cheng Ho. So this is a work dating from the 1930s, and it showed that Richard had good fundamentals in art training. I took the picture of a portrait by Richard Walker in National Gallery. You can see that he was able to achieve a high degree of realism. Richard Walker left Singapore in the 1950s, retired back to UK, and I couldn't find any more information about him. Richard Walker's most famous student was Lim Cheng Ho. Lim Cheng Ho studied in Raffles Institution and was Richard Walker's student. I heard from Lim Cheng Ho's son, Michael Lim, that his father rejected a scholarship to study art in UK after the education in RI. The reason being that Lim Cheng Ho felt that it was very difficult to have a career in the arts. So he chose to be a government servant, and he worked in what is then known as the Public Works Department, something like PUB, until his retirement. So although he did not pursue art full-time, he was very active in the art scene, and he was attributed to have founded the Singapore Watercolour Society. This is a painting by Lim Cheng Ho. You can see that he painted in the same style like Richard Walker. So what happened was, Richard Walker in the 1930s have a habit of going out in the weekend on Sunday to paint, and Lim Cheng Ho followed him. So this tradition started from 1930s and still carry on today. We call them the Sunday group, and even now on Sundays, there will be watercolor artists going out to paint together. And this inspired many younger artists, including Thomas Yeo. After some time, in the late 60s, this group of Sunday painters, they decided that they should form a society. And this is how the Singapore Watercolour Society came about. Next, we shall move on to the Asian immigrants, the ethnic Chinese. So the Asian immigrant influences were mainly represented by Chinese immigrants, and most of them came from the 1920s through the 1950s. In terms of artistic direction, they basically have two choices. One, they stick to their old traditional Chinese practice. Two, they change to assimilate with the cultures of the Nanyang. Among those who chose to remain in their Chinese tradition, we have Si Hang To. Si Hang To represented a group of artists who remained loyal to their Shanghai school traditions. And Si Hang To is an important art educator. He had many students, and many of his students came together and formed the Xiao Tao Art Society. And the Xiao Tao Art Society remains today as the most active Chinese ink society today. We also have another artist by the name of Zhan Dang Nong. Zhan Dang Nong is actually a Chinese scroll framer. He's also very good in traditional Chinese ink and seal carving. This is in line with the Shanghai school tradition of knowing calligraphy, painting, poets, and seal carving. In this example, you can see the striking similarities between Zhan Dang Nong's work with that of Sou Ping, suggesting that Zhan Dang Nong must have admired Sou Ping's work. So now we talk about the Nanjing Artists. The Nanjing Artists refers to those Chinese immigrant artists who were not contented with carrying on the mainland Chinese art traditions. So this group of artists, they mainly congregated at the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts. Their artistic direction was to further accept Western ideas and to assimilate their art with the unique cultures of Southeast Asia. The Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts opened its doors in 1938 with the support of Tan Xi-xiang and the Society of Chinese Artists. Mr. Tan Xi-xiang is actually the son of Mr. Tan Ka-ki. This shows that the existence of NAFA is closely backed by the Chinese business community. And the other part, the Society of Chinese Artists, gives it the technical support that it needs for this institution to exist. And Mr. Lim Hak Tai was the central figure in setting up the academy and was the first principal of the school. The school's curriculum was modeled after the Chinese art academies, in particular, the Xiamen Academy of Fine Arts. The Xiamen Academy of Fine Arts was co-founded by Mr. Lim Hak Tai. The students in NAFA had to study both Western and traditional ink paintings. The early NAFA was still very traditional in its curriculum. Some of the notable artists that taught Western painting include Zhong Baimu and Chen Renhao. Notable artists who taught in Chinese ink paintings are Si Hang To and Wu Zaiyan. This is an early photograph of Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts dated in 1939. We can see from the photo that Mr. Lim Hak Tai was seated in the middle, and to his right is Sou Ping, and to the left is probably Dr. Lim Boon Keng. And based on record, the location of this photograph is probably at 93 Serangoon Road. But NAFA, when it first opened, was at Geylang, in a shop house opposite the then Gay World. After the war in the 50s, NAFA moved to its new campus at 49 St. Thomas Walk. I have been there a few years ago, and the place is now a condominium. You can see that at that time, NAFA is actually also in a bungalow house. Sometime in the 80s, NAFA moved to Sophia Road. And then later, the government decided to step in to fund NAFA, and it became a semi-government institution, and now it is at the Bencoolen area. Let's talk a little bit about Lim Hak Tai. Lim Hak Tai was born in 1893 in China. He was a very well-known art educator, responsible for creation of NAFA. In his youth, back in his native Xiamen, he set up the Xiamen Academy of Fine Arts, and he was the vice principal at the time. Due to the time constraints from working at NAFA, Lim Hak Tai was unable to dwell very deep into his art. And I think it is a sacrifice that he made for all of us, because I think for most artists, they will want to produce good art. And because of that, his works are now very rare in the market, and his oil works are even more difficult to find. Over here, we have Zhong Baimu. Zhong Baimu, I would say, is a very secretive figure in the art history, not because he wants to be secretive, but we really cannot find any information about him. We don't know when he was born, and we do not know when he died. We only know sometimes after the World War II, he moved to Hong Kong. And we also know that he was a founding member of the Penang Chinese Art Society and was around when NAFA started. Based on what we see of his work today, we know that he achieved a fairly high standard. I think he is one of the strongest artists in Singapore during that time. Next, we have the famous Chen Chong Sui. Chen Shui was the only familiar artist of the pioneering generation who was here during the time when the Society of Chinese Artists was created in 1936. The rest disappeared in history. Some were killed during the Japanese occupation. Chen Shui first came to Penang in 1932 and then to Singapore in 1934. Most of Chen Shui's work are watercolors. And he also has some Chinese ink. And most of his Chinese ink, it is still, I would say, considered traditional ink landscape painting. But what he did was he changed a little bit to add in what we call the Nanyang flavor. For example, you see in this piece, the trees and the ground is actually using traditional methods, but he added figures that is actually from Nanyang. But by and large, I feel that he is still a traditional ink painter. So in conclusion, we would not use active to describe the art scenes in Singapore at that time. But at the same time, already in the 1920s and 30s, the foundations for a more vibrant art scene was already planted. And the other thing is, the major contributors of the art scene then were immigrants from China, in particular, the graduates from Shanghai art academies. And this was the root for Singapore art. I now have some questions for you to answer. The questions were designed to help you memorize and revisit some of the topics that we have discussed. And later, another slide will show you the answers.